Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Untethering Shame podcast. I'm your host, Kira Wackett, and today we're diving into part 2 of a powerful and deeply personal conversation with Sandra Hewitt on surviving life in and after a cult. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I highly recommend going back and checking it out first. In that episode, Sandra walks us through the beginnings of her story, what it meant to grow up inside a cult, how shame was used to control and condition behavior, and what it took to begin untangling those narratives once she left. You can find the link to that episode in the show notes below. Now, in part 2, Sandra continues to share her journey with raw honesty and courage. We talk about the complexities of identity and connection after leaving a high-control group, including the loneliness, the disconnection from others, and the painful reality of trying to relate to the outside world. Sandra also opens up about her struggles with suicidal thoughts, alcohol, and the ongoing work of healing, particularly in her relationship with her mom. This conversation is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the slow, non-linear path to reclaiming your truth after systems have tried to define it for you. So let's dive in. Sandra, I'm so excited for part 2. I've been like jazzed ever since we finished the first episode. And after just re-listening to it, I'm like, I'm so excited to go into this further with you.
Well, I'm really excited to be here. I've always kind of wanted to share my story, and it's honestly, this is the first time I've really done it in a public setting, and with you, it's just perfect.
Well, and listeners, if you haven't listened to episode 1, stop this right now. Go to the show notes and click the link. Go back to the episodes. However you want to get there, you need to listen to part 1 first, because Sandra and I mean, we just went on a journey of really learning about a person's experience developing their sense of self. That's really what we're talking about, is somebody that has had a myriad of different worlds and settings and systems to function in, going, I want to figure out what works best for me, and had this innate sense of commitment and courage to make the hard choices. And so, we talked about this in the first episode. I want to re-say it here because I think it's so important, especially when we say something like we're talking about cults and anything that kind of does that buzzworthy gossip, People magazine feel. We came into that first episode with such intention, where what we talked about was really the depth and in service of that collective shame healing experience. And so we're going to be really mindful of that again today, of what are the pieces of your story that are helpful, not only for you to heal in your own shame resilience journey, but for all of these listeners that get the opportunity to hear your story, how they can connect to it and, again, build that connection on that deeper level. I'm curious for you, if you can put your head back to the day we first recorded, how did you feel when we wrapped up session 1?
Good. I mean, to be honest, I've learned how to be vulnerable from a very young age, and I've actually had to temper it over time, because when I used to meet new people, tell me about yourself, whatever, I would launch right into, I was born into a cult, yada, yada, yada. And it was very normal for me to do that. And in a way, I think it served as an interesting piece about myself that would make people want to talk to me. And it just relieved the burden of like small talk, because immediately, they'd ask me questions and we'd go right into the deep end. And I've always said I don't swim in the shallow end. And in my healing journey, I've had to reel that back in. My boyfriend was actually the first to tell me that when I talk about my cult experiences, that there's an expression of pain that will come across my face. And he was the first to say, do you need to tell everybody that? Like, what is the purpose behind there? So that was really instrumental to me, kind of, like I said, reeling that back in, and really just sharing that part of myself with people that matter, or
Mm-hmm.
people that I feel like are looking for something that my experience can help with.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. So I had three things that happened while you were talking. The first was I was imagining freshman orientation for you in college and people saying, "Hi, how are you? Tell me about yourself." And then that sort of emotional unloading that would happen. And not because you were trying to take up all this space, but because, you grew up in a community where people were, everything is on your sleeve and everybody's sharing everything. And probably a part of that was, I just want to put it on the table. I don't want it to be this hidden thing. But you had mentioned in the last episode too, you talked about shallow versus deep end. So it's interesting that you referred back to it, because you said essentially you had to learn how to kind of test out other people's shallow ends before you dove into the deep end with them. And so that realization that the inherent trust that was kind of, I don't want to say indoctrinated into you, but it was definitely a system,
Mm-hmm.
a foundational pillar of the community that you grew up in, was that you inherently trust everyone and share everything. And so then when you were doing
Yeah.
that in a very different setting, I mean, I could imagine you were never really gifted with the opportunity to ask yourself, why am I sharing this? Who is this for? And so I'm grateful that your experience in our first recording didn't feel like that it felt more of that depth piece where you got to try on, what do I want to share for me and in service of the values and the mission I have about putting my story out into the
Yeah.
world.
Absolutely.
So tell me more about that, because I think, again, for any listener that hasn't listened to the first episode, I'll give you one more reminder. Pause right now, go back and listen to it so you can understand some of these layers and why we're going back to them. I found myself wanting to talk a little bit more about your first 17 years of life, because we knew you were born into this cult. Mom and dad were one of the, or I guess two of the main people kind of when it got
Yeah.
started. You're born into it. You spend your first 17 years there and then you leave. What would you say that first 17 years was like? Were you miserable from, I don't want to say day one, because I guess you were a baby, but were you miserable the whole time? Did you have fond memories? Talk to us a little bit about the depth of that experience.
I definitely wasn't miserable the whole time. The way that it was set up was really actually a beautiful space for kids, simply because there
Mm,
were, gosh, I don't know, over a dozen kids. And that meant that, we had a piano teacher that would come and give us all piano lessons once a week. We had hula lessons, various dance lessons, swim lessons every summer.
mm,
And we were almost always together during part of the day, the kids were. We ate dinner together 6 nights a week. And then we also gathered on the seventh night. So there was just
mm,
this really deep level of community. And like you said, sharing lives with others. We also shared a home with a family that had four little girls. So I lived with one of the three musketeers, of which I was one already.
mm,
So it was actually really beautiful, and it's one of the reasons it's actually taken me a really long time to come to this healing journey. It took a long time for me to even realize that there was more bad than good. It took maturing
mm,
really to see a lot of that, and quitting drinking as well. We also were on a farm, so there's a huge amount of property that we got to run around on, get lost in, and climb trees. It was very rural. We also had horses, so we had
mm,
horseback riding lessons. I mean, it was very idyllic for kids,
mhm,
until you got to around middle school. I think is around the time when you really want to be like the other kids. You don't want to be so different. And then it wasn't in.
Because you were going to school with people that weren't a part of the cult.
We went to public school.
Okay.
There were so many teachers in the cult that I think the idea was that we wouldn't act out or do anything, because we were not only watched by the other kids, and that is really one of the main things about cult life is that everyone polices each other. Which is a really negative part of it. And so it was all public school. And then by the time I hit high school, that was really when I started looking at my life and wondering if it was what I wanted. There were a couple different times, I'd say maybe 3 times, before I was in high school, that someone left in the middle of the night. Other people would come and visit. So I did have some experience with other people leaving. And then people who were interested in the cult. And then you could also learn about their lives outside of it. And several of those people that visited really kind of made me think, like, this woman is so cool, and she also is very good and kind and wonderful. I also got to meet a couple gay men, and that really, I wouldn't say shocked me, but just really made me question things, because they tend to be happy and wonderful and effusive and things that I admire about people. So high school was really the time that I started looking around and questioning. And then it was also a time when, we were based on Hinduism. And in Hinduism, you have a Satguru, who is like Jesus in Christianity, and you have a guru, who is like your pastor or preacher. And that would be our quote unquote Swami. So our Swami titled himself, but we had a Swami that our Satguru, Anandamayama, had made a Swami. And that's actually the way that you become a Swami, is someone above you does that for you. And seeing the 2 Swamis next to each other was like day and night. One so incredibly ego and anger filled, and the other just emitted just love and kindness and light, and you could just feel good being around them. And I just was like, wow, this person is what I think of when I think of a holy person, and our Swami is not, and what else? One of the 3 musketeers left in 10th grade, and she was sent to live with relatives who were not great. Swami intentionally picked the relatives that he thought she would suffer with, which she did. And he also controlled when she could speak to her parents, who did not leave with her. So I got to see that and how terrible that was. Then 2 other high school kids left. Their mother was in a different country, and they went back to live with her. And then the one that really made me understand that it wasn't a choice anymore, it was just figuring out how I was going to leave, was that there were 2 young girls that were molested. And while the cult did prosecute that man to the full extent of the law, we had a meeting about what happened that same night in our dining hall. And several of the adult women had warned Swami against the relationship with this man and the young girls. and just said, as they're reaching puberty, there needs to be more separation. They need to be sleeping out in the living room rather than in the same room with this person and his wife. Even though the wife's there, this is still inappropriate. And Swami said, it'll be fine in theory, because he claimed that he was realized Ananda Mayama would warn him or show him if something was going to happen. So he really kind of brushed everything under the rug. And sure enough, it happened. And one of the women asked, why did you not see this happening? Why did you not stop it? And he said, because karma needed to be served. And it just hit me right then and there. And I didn't know it was called victim blaming at the time, but it just seemed so incredibly wrong. And so, yeah, from then I essentially started developing my way out. I spoke to 2 great friends' families. They were going to take me in. And so then it was just, when was I going to do it?
Yeah, the logistics versus the decision. Yeah. And well, so there's a couple things that are really interesting. So one, whether it is a smaller cult, and I say that more in the sense of kind of a microcosm, it's not the entire country, or a leader of a country and people following blindly or falling in line with that, I think we can see that there are problems when people are in positions of power where they can manipulate things in a way that removes free will and removes that opportunity to, what was taught or what was promoted of this idea of community, of safety. You're watching how the ego can erode that, because when a person or a group gets to that place, you can't hold both. You can't hold and create safety and community while you're also looking out for your ego. And so if it really is about, you mentioned this person being so filled with anger and entitlement, they are incapable of seeing these other pieces or components, and likely thinking maybe something wasn't going to happen, or maybe it really was a belief that they would be given a message that something was going to take place. And then when it didn't, this is where the vulnerability piece kicks in. And if there's somebody that sounds like exhibited some narcissistic tendencies, they're going to do anything they can to point the finger at someone else. And so it's interesting because you're seeing these things that I'm going, well, I could see that in so many different positions of power in companies that you work for, in countries at large, in communities at large. And so I think it's really interesting because people have sort of looked at cults and they're like, but you can see this is the bad guy. Like, I'm watching the horror film and I know this is the killer, and yet you're still walking into a room with them. Like that kind of idea. But that's really not how it is. It is a very subtle erosion of a sense of self, masked in some of the goodness. Like you said, as a child, what a beautiful place to be where you did feel safe until the veil was lifted and you had these moments. I thought there was 2 interesting points. So your parents were some of the initial people that founded the cult. My guess is by the time you're in high school, you're really the first cohort of people that have lived your life inside of the cult and are now making this decision of mass exit. And so how interesting is that too? I mean, I'm assuming there were some kids that were a part of the cult originally, like some people that joined that already had children. Yeah. But I think there's an interesting element to that. And you sort of witnessing all of this and realizing, the ideal would be you're the first round of fully, I have been in the cult my whole life. So on that sense of like embodiment of this community, you hypothetically should be all in. And you're not. And so what a threat to that culture. And then the overlap thing I thought was what you're describing, that sense of things, what feels right to me, what feels right to other people. I also feel this pull to want to fit in. I also want to create my own independent life. Feels not that dissimilar from any other high school student's experience. Yeah. It was just through the lens of making a harder decision to leave a cult maybe versus a family. And even in that was your family. Yeah. And so it's interesting as you hear stories. We want to see things as being so different, but at its core, you were going through something so similar to so many other people, that loneliness, that drive for something other than what you were a part of, that witnessing your values not showing up in the people around you, getting clear with that. I mean, it would make sense to me that then it felt so hard when you left that you couldn't bond with other people right away, because so many other people were struggling with that same thing. It just felt like maybe you couldn't get a bridge to get there with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And having to teach myself, how to make small talk and relate to other people. Of course, I made some friends while I was in public school, but there's a huge difference between making friends with the student that sat right next to you versus, college feels a little different to me. You're not, even though you're all in the same school, you're much more spread out than you would be in, say, middle or high school. And so it was more than a little difficult. And I essentially spent the first year of college suicidal. I basically had a plan, and I flirted with that plan 5 days a week at least. And that's around the time when I really started drinking. And that allowed me to push all of those negative feelings into a dark hole and just really kind of keep them down.
Yeah. And I could imagine. I mean, so was drinking for you this, I do it alone by myself to numb out? Or was it, I went to parties and then suddenly I'm drinking and I can feel that pressure goes away. I feel like the stories in my head are quieter. I can talk to other people. I like this version of me. She can do the small talk and she can do the ridiculous things. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I want that version of me to show up. And when I'm not drinking, this other version shows up that isn't getting me connection and feels alone and wants to kill herself. And so I don't want that. If the trade-off is maybe I have a little bit of a hangover, that's worth mm-hmm. it. And then I'm assuming over time, drinking just started to edge its way in more and more for you, because the voice is always going to get louder and louder until we actually heal it. But you're, 18, 19 years old. How the fuck are you supposed to know that? Like you still are trying to figure out who you are. Like any other person at that age, you don't realize that what you're doing is also stopping you from any of the healing that you are both entitled to and are capable of. And I'm assuming there's the third layer in this that, you had mentioned in the first episode, mom decided to leave with you. Dad was kicked out. But your relationship with both of them, you said around that time, you weren't really talking to them about this. So the two people that would have really understood or maybe been able to be there with you didn't feel safe for different reasons, different choices. And then again, you already felt like all these people around you are looking at you going, yeah, you're like a little different. And so now it's just like, this is now just the mask I have to wear. I don't have a choice and I don't see another option at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. And growing up, psychiatrists, psychologists, any sort of psychotropic meds were very frowned upon. Swami mm-hmm. had said, if it's in your brain, then you can fix it. So there are times when I've thought about it, and I think that even had I told my mom, which a big yeah. reason was that I did not want her to, worry incessantly. I didn't want her to pull me out of college, things like that. Yeah. I also don't know if she would have been able to get me the appropriate help. And right. I also say that because she also witnessed some of my worst drinking, and she didn't push me towards help then either. She was just more worried. So yeah, it was, I, like you said, I think I made the choice that felt best, that for yeah. me, without realizing that it was a choice.
Yeah. I mean, because I don't think at that time it could have felt that way when it felt like you're standing on the edge. And this is the only little pathway that you could take that gets you any sense of relief. And I think that's what, whenever anybody's talking about their addiction stories, people get so fixated on whatever drug they did, whatever substance they were addicted to, whatever, if it's sex, food, anything, without realizing that for many people, it was, I mean, that's the surfaced most point to their pain. That is a symptom of the underlying piece. And so, my guess is, had we changed the entire context of your circumstances, there's still a potential that you had a genetic predisposition to depression. Some of these things could have happened on their own. So it's hard to go, well, it's all based on these experiences and this loneliness and what you felt through. But there's a layering of that. There's a layering of additional otheredness that you felt. And it's really challenging at that time. I used to talk about this all the time. I mean, even back where we worked, where I'd have conversations with parents and caregivers of, part of the reason that your kid is suicidal is that their brain is literally incapable of seeing past high school. They cannot comprehend that the world could be different or that this suffering is temporary. They just feel alone, and they just feel like they have nothing to give them any sense of hope it's going to change. And so if your brain was already starting to develop that, and in this community that was supposed to be safe, you didn't have it. Now, when we talked about this, I know last time, this idea, well, I chose to leave, so I better suck it up and be okay, mixed with, but this isn't going away. So maybe the problem is me. Maybe it wasn't my circumstances. Maybe I'm just broken. So then this makes you feel less broke. And why would you not have picked it? One of the things that you just said that I thought was really interesting, though, is you said, I don't know that my mom would have been able to be there for me. Probably, you mentioned her being worried, things like that. But I'm curious, when you left, mom, you talked about her last time. You were closest with mom. You and dad had a degree of separation. There was a lot of surface anger towards dad at that point. But mom chose to leave with you. So there had to be some sense of comfort in that. But it sounds like it wasn't as easy as we left and everything was great. Sounds like there's a bumpier relationship there. Tell me more about that.
So I had not planned for my parents to end up leaving with me. And when we left, they still kept many of the same rules that I'd grown up with, which I found very stifling. And many of the rules were why I wanted to leave. And so that was really dismaying for me. And of course, I did everything possible to circumvent them. But I also just think that she couldn't, and likely will never be able to fully understand what it's like having lived your life one way and then living it a completely different way that you've been completely unprepared for, due to the fact that she lived in the quote unquote world before she was in the cult and then went back to the world. So for her, it was just returning to something she mostly understood. So that...
And with the protection of rules that she kept and could design her life around that she felt good about. Yeah. It was a choice. You grew up in an environment you didn't get to choose and then left. And then she was still inadvertently wanting you to live that life. And that, that's going to put distance between you.
Yeah, definitely. And looking back, I think that for many, many years after I left, talking about the cult in the manner that I wanted to and fully expressing my feelings about it wasn't really something that I did with either of my parents. I don't know if it was because I thought they wouldn't understand or what exactly. Maybe that previous attempts hadn't gone well. So I just didn't really discuss much with them. And of course, the longer I went and the older I got, the more became apparent to me that was wrong with the cults and my childhood. and I didn't have anything, anywhere to go with it, anything to do with it that I could really understand. And honestly, drinking wasn't the only thing that I overindulged in.
Mm-hmm.
Weed also really helps all those thoughts that you don't want to have to just go away temporarily. And it also contributed to a lot of memory loss, which actually I think compounded on top of the memory loss I already had. So, so yeah, my relationship with mom has gone through a lot of transformation during my life. We have gone from being extremely close in my childhood, even up through my 30s, because I lived with her again when I moved back to Hawaii for 7 years. And it was actually a really wonderful time because we had never been able to be mother and daughter without interference from someone else who could, I guess, subvert her control or, change her rules and things like that. And during that time was probably the first time I really had any blowout arguments with her. And they were very few and far between. She was a state debate champ in high school. So she is very difficult to just converse with. She loves to play the devil's advocate. So in many ways, it was difficult to talk to her about many, many things. And so I just didn't.
Yeah.
And then, like we talked about, I quit drinking 2 to 3 years ago. And and around that time was when I got together with my current boyfriend, and he really was able to see a lot of the things that I didn't, not only about myself, but also about my relationship with my mom, and was really kind of able to point out some areas where the relationship may not have been fair to me. And I wasn't being fair to myself because I was still masking a lot of what I felt from my mom. So pandemic, we mentioned in the last episode, pandemic really broke me wide open. The cruelty of the world, I think, became I couldn't ignore it any longer. And that was around the time that I really stopped talking to her. Our phone calls were months between, even texting was really sparse. And she definitely noticed. And that relationship actually was another big reason why I really decided to pursue healing, because I was unwilling to have this kind of relationship with my mom because we had been so close for so long, and I knew that needed repair along with my relationship with myself. So through my therapist, she actually met with my mom and me 3 or 4 times while I was going through the intensive outpatient program. That was at my request because I felt unable to say what I wanted to her without fear that I wasn't going to be able to get it out, that, she would do many of the debate things with me. And I had never been taught to stand up to authority figures or really argue in general.
Yeah.
So it was very useful, and it really was the first step towards repair in our relationship. But I shouldn't say still, but I have grown to understand that she will likely never really see things from my perspective. She has found a very great level of happiness in her life. And so she doesn't want to open closed doors. She doesn't really want to go back and, I guess, discuss her responsibility really for choosing to raise me in a cult. And we've actually had talks where she's said, I was considering leaving when you were in 8th grade. But your father said that, and it wasn't the first time she'd considered it, it was probably the time that she was most likely going to do it, but ended up not doing it because he told her that, he would make sure that I was taken from her. And she knew that he had the money and the might of the whole cult behind him.
Yeah.
And so learning that, part of me, because she's worked in the legal field her whole life, part of me is like, well, you have way more knowledge than my dad does, and you work for a very powerful attorney. But then again, that's me looking from the outside in. That's me, and also from looking at it in retrospect. And we can't really do that. So there's just been a lot of healing that she and I have had to go through and are going to have to go through. I think mostly for me to feel really comfortable confiding in her and unmasking with her.
When you were talking, there's a few things I think, there's going to be people listening that can hear themselves as you describe your relationship with your mom. This idea of a person in a position of power who doesn't give you the same space to be heard. And I think about that as somebody who, I've been pretty vocal on here about the relationship I'm working through with my own mom. And it isn't this authoritarian, I shut you down, I don't want to hear you, I'm debating with you. It is this very covert, narcissistic way of making everything subtly come back to feeling bad for and taking care of her emotional needs, and it always ultimately being about her. And I struggle with that now as a mom, where I don't ever want Everly to feel like she can't ask me something, have a different opinion, talk to me about how she feels, which I think is what happens to a lot of us when we become parents, is we're like, I'm not going to fuck you up the way that my parent fucked me up. And so then we find new ways to do it. So I'm aware we're human. Like, I'm not a perfect parent. But so I hear some overlap in that pain with you of, basically your mom is incapable of taking responsibility for some of the choices that she made and the things that are her responsibility, probably because the shame is too deep.
Exactly.
Because she's got her own healing to do that she's either unwilling to do, which in some ways would be easier because then that means she could choose it and she could do it. But there's also a chance she's incapable of doing it. And that's a really hard pill to swallow. That's a big thing I've had to work through with my mom is it isn't that my mom doesn't want to do it. I want to believe that because then I can be mad at her and I can have an expectation of something being different. It's the acceptance. She cannot do it. She cannot. She does not have the brain capacity or the emotional functioning, the genetic wiring, whatever shit you want to say, to be able to do it. And that sucks because then that means that radical responsibility, all I can do is set boundaries to have a safe and supportive relationship with myself, with her in the degree that I want to, and to have her in my daughter's life. And I think that's the hard part is, it seems like, we've used the metaphor already, so we'll keep it going. The veil lifted a few different times on life and pain and suffering and the depth of human experience. And, the easy thing would be to say, well, this is the best way to live, or this person's right, or this person's wrong, this person's good, this person's evil. But just realizing that the complexity of the human experience is so much bigger. And for you and your mom, you long for this joint healing to happen. And you have this innate drive in you. I understand that for a period of time, drinking showed up and weed, and there's all these different things that came up to help mask because you couldn't grieve it all and heal it all at one time. Yeah. But you also have this innate drive in you to do the hard thing, to make the choice that feels most right to you, even if it's the most difficult choice for you. And so it's hard then when someone's on the other side of that pain point, not making that same choice or not being as willing to be uncomfortable. And that, I think, for anybody but would be difficult, but also going back to what you grew up being taught, which is everybody's always trying to do best for each other and to grow and to heal and to learn.
Yeah.
And with somebody like your mom who still buys into, I don't know if she still does, but at least for a period of time was buying into so many elements of sort of the foundation of that community, to then not be doing that is such a weird mind fuck in your brain. And again, just creates this loneliness that's very different from, well, I just can't make friends because I feel awkward, to why can't we connect when this is the closest person to me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay. So I'm thinking about this. I mean, I feel like we could, this is why you're going to write a book at some point, because there's so much wisdom and beauty in your story. And again, I think in service of helping people understand and build compassion for someone's experience, not just for you, but for mom and dad. When they joined this community, they weren't going, I want to fuck up my kids. I believe everybody else is terrible. They were trying to make the most right decision to live the best way that they could. And they were looking for other people to be a part of that with them. And so all of us are guided by these ideas of this is what's right for us. This is, and just making the best decision they could. And then just getting to peel that back and realizing it's so much more nuanced for each of you, and for you in particular with kind of thinking about this. And so I'm curious, because we're going to leave some cliffhangers here, because there's stuff that, I still want to know so many different pieces of your journey and all of the decades of processing and healing and all of this. But that's, again, everyone, you're going to go and follow Sandra so that when her book comes out or she starts teasing things in blog posts, you're going to go read more so that we can continue this. But one of the things that you mentioned that I know you've been working on, and in particular with sobriety and really getting to know yourself, you talked about one of the biggest things that you've had to do is to build a sense of trust with yourself, a sense of connection to you. And so when you think about, let's say you're listening to this episode in 6 months, what are the things that you want to be able to celebrate that you've done, that you've made space for? What's that next leg of this process for you, and continually deepening and strengthening that sense of self-trust and love with yourself?
Well, when you talk about self-trust, various other words come up for me, like the perfectionism, procrastination, paralyzation. That cycle is something that I wrestle with a lot. And I do think that that's connected to trusting myself. In the next 6 months, I think a way that would help me move forward and would be an example of me truly trusting myself is me actually going through and writing the business plan for the business that I have in mind that sparks more joy than any other thing that I've thought up so far. And I've had this idea for months now, and it's been really difficult for me to start, just because of the self-doubt, the fact that one of the things that the cult left in me is like this need to always do things with other people. So embarking on this big, huge thing that I've never done, it's not like I took business in college. I feel very weak when it comes to money. Those kinds of things. And so looking at starting this is terribly frightening to me, so much so that I haven't done it. I haven't even started. So that in 6 months, if we can meet and I'm like, hey, I got a business plan, or I have half a business plan, like that would be amazing. So yeah, I think that would be the biggest example of me trusting myself, is actually doing these things that I really desperately want, but I'm so afraid I'm going to fuck up. And that fear of fucking up makes me not do it. And I really don't want to let any more dreams pass me by.
And I think for you too, it's this element of recognizing that you can never leap or do something new without fear being there, because it is attempting to protect you from a perceived threat. And you have this perception that failing is terrible. You can't fail. You can't do anything wrong. You can't go at it alone. How dare you create this life? How dare you? On some level, your depression brain, all of your self-talk is going to be, how dare you aim for something that brings you joy and happiness? You don't deserve that. You are not deserving of those things, so you can't try to claim them. And so, at least for me, one of the things that I hold on to is I can't actually do anything to make those thoughts go away. They're not going to stop, because on some weird, twisted, fucked up level, my brain thinks it's helpful. So instead it's going, gosh, they're there. They're never going to go anywhere. And they're there whether I do the hard thing or not. Like, they don't stop if I listen to them. They're still telling me these things. And so what does it look like to have a both and? I can feel that I don't deserve this, and I can do this, and kind of allowing both to sit. And I wonder for you what that would look like. And going back to when you made the decision to leave the cult, it was a series of 1% decisions, steps, choices. And then eventually you still had to do the hard thing, which was actually leave, that final cut. And then it was a series of steps, choices, decisions to go from being a 17-year-old to where you are now, and all the work that you've done. And there are moments, themes, choices, years that you're like, no, that didn't trend upwards. And then there are ones that did. But if we look at the overall progression of you in your life and where you've gotten to, you see the overall trend and experience. And so it's also taking the weight off of, what if your first business plan flops? What if somebody doesn't invest in it? What if this happens? What if you have to change your business plan 10 times? Like, okay, but can you trust in your values and your intention more than the success of those bullet points? How much money are you going to make? How successful are you going to be? All the things that our culture still promotes, and instead going, what is the thing that drives me every day? How do I lead with that? And then now, what a cool invitation to build community with people to support you where you get to lead it. And not because you are, I have to be the best, I'm the leader, I'm on top, this very ego place like we talked about before with leadership, but more, I get to lead my life. And I'm going to build up the community that I choose, so I don't have to be alone, quote unquote, but I am allowed to take the first step forward and to be in the front. Ooh, I love this. I love everything about this. I can't wait to, want to immediately, I wish I could go and edit it right now so I could listen to this one and go back to back on the two. So all I'm going to say to everybody, I guess maybe I lied. This is going to be your third invitation. If you've listened to this whole episode and you still didn't listen to episode number 1, go back and listen to that. So it will tie in some of these pieces. I also think that Sandra did a great job bringing in some of the points from the first episode that were really key and important. And I'm just so grateful that you trusted me and you trusted this audience and this space to allow us to unpack some of these pieces. And I will be the first to host you once your book is out so that we can do a book launch talk and really start promoting that. So you have to keep all of us in the loop on that. Listeners, make sure you go to the show notes. Make sure you connect with Sandra. Also, just, again, check in with what biases were brought up for you today or in those episodes. Check in with where you felt connection. Just spend some time with some of that and think about what you learned about yourself by listening to this story and what you can bring to the community in terms of awareness, empathy, compassion as we take other stories and really start to expand the way we think about the world. As always, I will be back here next Sunday with another amazing episode. But until then, enjoy the rest of your days. And remember, we don't have to do it all at once. It is one step forward and giving ourselves space and grace to know that when we flop, fumble, fail, that's totally normal, deserving, and appropriate. All right. We'll see you all next week.